us on live TV. Okay, let's all go ahead and find a spot to sit down. Let me get the attention of those people out in the foyer. It is time for class. It didn't do any good, but at least I said it. Okay, today we are continuing our series of lessons. Yes. Today we're continuing our series of lessons on the book of Esther. And as I'm going to read that little opening paragraph that I wrote for you all here. It seems to make sense to me. Bring up the timpanis. Let the orchestra build to a triple forte. That means very loud. The grand climax is about to arrive. Yet only as we, the audience, and Esther know what is about to transpire. We know what's going to happen. Girls. Yet even Esther does not know exactly how things are going to end. She is acting totally on the basis of faith here, because if the king does not go along with her plan, then she's going to find herself going the way of Vashti, if you remember her from the first chapter. But the timorous young woman of less than a week ago has become a mighty champion for her people. Remember, she was afraid less than a week before to do what needed to be done. She thought, well, you know, the king has this rule: if anybody enters into his presence and he has not summoned them and he doesn't want them there, then they get taken away for good. But if he holds forth the scepter, well, then they'll be okay. Fortunately for Esther, the king held forth his scepter, and she was allowed into his presence. What she did at that time, oh, thank you, my lovely assistant. What she did is that he recognized about her that her countenance had fallen. Now, it had fallen, you know, because they had developed a plan where all the Jews were to be destroyed. All the Jews were to be killed. Now, the king did not know that she was a Jew. Haman did not know that she was a Jew. And so she invited the king and Haman to come to a banquet which that day she had prepared. Well, they came to the banquet, loved the whole thing, and the king said to her, I will give you up to half of my kingdom. What is it that you desire? What is it that you want? And she says, I want you to come to tomorrow's banquet. I want you to come to the banquet I have tomorrow, and there I will reveal to you what is the cause of my concerns. So, pull yourselves to the front of your seats, hold on for a dramatic climax, because here it comes. In the first 6 verses, we have Esther's petition. Esther's petition. So in Esther chapter 7, the first 6 verses, I'm going to go ahead and read these aloud. You can read along with me quietly. It says, now the king and Haman, remember Haman is kind of like the grand vizier. He's second only in the kingdom to King Ahasuerus, or we better know him better perhaps from our secular history as Xerxes. So King Xerxes and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen, because that's what she invited them for. In verse 2, and the king said to Esther on the second day also, as they drank their wine at the banquet, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom it shall be done. Wow, that's awesome. Then Queen Esther answered and said, this is where the music goes up, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given to me as my petition, and my people as my request. Now, he's blindsided by this whole thing. He has no clue about what she's talking about, because he signs decrees all the time. And the fact that he signed one that said that the Jews were to be all eradicated from the kingdom on the such and such day of the 12th month, he didn't have a clue about that particular thing. But that is what's going on here. And so she wants her life and her people. Verse 4, for we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not be commensurate with the annoyance to the king. You know, can you imagine saying, well, if you weren't going to sell me as a slave, I don't bother you about that. No, I don't want to trouble you with that sort of thing. Really? Wow. She certainly had respect for the king. Then King Ahasuerus asked Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who would presume to do thus? And Esther said, a foe and an enemy. A foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman. And then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. Can you imagine? I mean, Haman has seen what the king is willing to do. He got rid of his first wife just because she said, I'm not going to show up because you're just treating me like some sort of piece of meat here, and I'm not going to show up for your banquet. Wow. He removed her from her position within the kingdom, and nothing else has been ever heard of Vashti, at least not recorded in the scriptures. And so here we have some questions for us to consider. We know God is going to do his part on this evening. God is always involved. In Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, let me tell you how this is oftentimes misquoted. The way people oftentimes misquote, and you tell me if you've heard it this way. In Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, people say, well, we know all things work together for good to those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. Let me say that again just a little slower. See if you've heard this. We know all things work together for good to those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. Is there anybody in this room that has not heard it read or spoken that way? Yes, but that's not what Romans chapter 8 verse 28 says. What it says is, we know God causes all things to work together for good. Things, brethren, don't work. When people say, well, things will just work out. Things don't work. Things don't work. God, however, is at work. And he is at work in the lives of every single one of us, all at the same time. I mean, talk about the awesome nature of God. We know, the Bible tells us that he is omnipotent. That means he's all-powerful. But he's also omniscient, which means he is all-knowing. And he's omnipresent, which means he is everywhere at the same moment in time. And so God is working in the lives of all of us. Things aren't working in your lives. God is at work in our lives. And so we know God is going to do his part on this evening for his people. But Esther has also played her role to perfection. She was great. List the positive things Esther has done to bring about this culmination of everything. What are some things that Esther has done in order to prepare for this particular moment? List them off for me, those of you who have been here. If you haven't been here but you know, Guy? She is humble. I mean, good grief. I think I've done this sort of thing with you before. Let me show you something. Could I get you to stand up for me, please? Mm-hmm. What's your name, by the way?
Bobby.
Bobby? Hi, Bobby. I'm Rick. I want you to hold your hand out like this. Okay? Just hold your hand out like that. You may notice that I'm trying to go that way. Of course, Bobby's a strong guy, so he's not letting me. I didn't tell him to restrain or something. Thanks, Bobby. You can sit down now. Everybody in the world just saw you, Bobby. Of course, it was the back of your head, but I'm sure they're pleased and impressed. But this is the way that most, at least men, are. If you do that sort of thing, ask a man, just hold your hand there. And you don't tell him, resist me. Just do what I did. Put your hand there and start pushing. Bobby first, he goes, and back we come. Because that's the way us guys are. We're not going to let somebody push us around, as it were. Now, a lot of times, although I think probably 21st century women, it may be different, but a woman, you start pushing her hand, she'll go. She's wondering why you're doing it, but she's allowing it to happen. This is the way guys don't. Guy is right. Esther was humble. She allowed things to happen. She didn't force. She's not pushing this particular thing to happen. And I don't want to say too much more because I'll give away some of the other things that Esther did to bring about this event. So you tell me, what are some other things besides her humility? What else do we know about Esther and what she has done to bring about this eventuality? Yes, ma'am.
She prayed and fasted before.
Yes, she did. That before entering into the king's presence, because she said, the king has not called for me into his presence for these past 30 days. I can't just show up. Don't know what could happen. Mordecai says, if you don't show up for these people, you're going to be gone. God is still going to spare his people, but you won't be a part of that. So she said, well, I'll tell you what. You have your people pray and fast with me, and I will have and the girls that are her attendants, we will pray and fast for the next 3 days. And so, yes, she approached this issue in prayer, and she added fasting. What else did she do? Yes, ma'am, Norma.
She tells him, please spare my life and the life of my people. So she identifies who she is, and then she says, we're going to be destroyed, annihilated, and killed. So there's no hint to the king that she's not afraid of something big.
Yeah, she used big words in the sense that they're very, they catch your attention right now. I mean, when she says that we are to be destroyed, she would have just said, there's somebody out to kill us. Well, the king realized that. Remember, Mordecai has already revealed there was a plot against his life. People are against you all the time. It just comes with the territory. Yeah, but she didn't say they just want to be killed. She starts with, want to be destroyed, killed, annihilated. So she's really shaking his cage right now, trying to get him to perceive what's going on. And it's not just her people, because as queen, of course, she's concerned about the people, but she was hoping the king was concerned about her. And so, yes, that's very good. What else? Yes, sir, Larry?
Has anyone included the word courage? She's courageous.
That's a good word. Why do you say that?
Well, even after her appeal to God and having the others to pray and to fast, she's still uncertain of the outcome. She doesn't really, this may not be God's way of working things out. But she has the strength and the courage to go into something. She knows that after 30 days, no one is even approaching the king.
Yep.
This may not end.
Ooh, that's good. Yeah, it may not end the way she hopes it does. Yeah, and some people, I think it's important for us to understand, courage is not what people who have no fear exhibit. If you don't have any fear, there's no courage. But if there's a lot to be afraid of, and yet you're willing to go forth anyhow, that is what courage is. And certainly Esther, Queen Esther here, she's got a lot of courage. Mike, did you have your hand raised there?
Yeah, she was forethought and planning. I mean, she knew what she had to do. She knew how to do it. She first had to get the king's attention without offending him. So she dresses up and then gets where he's going to see her.
That's really good.
That's what starts all this, because she had to know how to get his attention without.
Yeah, Esther's pretty good at that sort of thing, because there were, what?
It says she puts on her royal robes.
Mm-hmm. And remember when they had the beauty contest, the Miss Persia contest? Remember that all the beautiful women were brought before him, and each night another beautiful woman would go into him and that sort of thing? She had a lot of people that she had to go beyond to impress the king. But she did, so you're right. She did that. And something when you said forethought, when she went to the presence of the king that first time, he says, what is it that you want? She says, I want you to attend a banquet that I have prepared for you. She already, the banquet was prepared. Wouldn't it have been interesting if the king would have said, Esther, I didn't call for you, take her out, kill her. And then, that banquet would just go empty. But she had already forethought that I will have him come to a banquet, because when she said that, it talks about how King Ahasuerus, he said, Haman, come on, let's go to the party. And so she had planned that he was going to say yes. See, that's what faith is. Faith is acting as though, I mean, that's what Jesus tells us. He says, when you pray, pray believing that you have received it. And she did. And so, very good. So those are some of the things that she did. She fasted in order to beseech the Lord's favor. And what's another word for favor? Grace. And so she fasted that she would receive grace from the king, but also from the Lord. She put on the 2 banquets, and she knew. This is a thing that, remember I mentioned, I think, in our very first lesson in this series. She knew the king's affinity for parties. Because let me read you some parties and for wine. Chapter 1, verses 5 through 10. There's a party that's been going on for 180 days. Chapter 2 and verse 18. Chapter 3 and verse 15. Chapter 5, verses 4 and 5, 7 and 8. And chapter 6 and verse 14. All those verses are talking about parties. It's good to be king. There's a party going on if you're a king. Yes, sir, Daryl?
I just want to say that Esther also showed her persistence in God's ever-loving care. She put her trust in God, and she would not have been asking this favor if she had not trusted her God first to give her the strength and the courage to go forth and ask them.
Oh, yeah. She definitely is a woman of... a number of years ago, President Kennedy wrote a book called Profiles in Courage. It won a Pulitzer Prize, by the way. Not that that means anything. But Esther is certainly a profile in courage. Good point. Good point. Okay. A repeated motif in the Bible is when ungodly people make plans to destroy one or more of God's people, but God turns things around and brings about a good result. Now see, here's the situation. Haman has made plans to destroy all the Jews. What's to stop it? Well, God. He turns things around here. What are some of the places in the Bible where this is done, where we see this same sort of thing, where somebody makes a plan, but God intervenes and causes their wicked plan to be turned for good? Remember, well, I'm not going to say it because this would give away one of them, but you'll probably give it to me and then we can work with it. What are some places where people have sought to do harm, but God turned it around? Larry. Excellent choice. My first one. Yes, sir. And it is in Genesis chapter 37, verses 18 through 21. His brothers want to kill him. Fortunately, the oldest brother, Reuben, steps in and says, no, let's not kill him. But then Judah comes along and says, well, I'll tell you what, why don't we just sell them into slavery? Because there were some Midianite slavers that were passing by, and they chose to do that sort of thing. But we know that God turned that around. I mean, he had to go from the pit to Potiphar to prison to the palace. I just thought of that. Boy, that's alliterative, folks. That'll preach right there. But the thing is remember when their father died, when Jacob died, his brothers thought, oh, he was just being nice to us because of Dad. Now Dad has died. He's going to take us out. And so they came and knelt before him weeping and, oh, spare us and all that sort of thing. But in Genesis chapter 50, the last chapter of the book of Genesis, and in verse 20, Joseph says to them, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. See, that's the thing. God is at work. And it doesn't matter what people intend. It's about what really that we should be counting on is, what is God going to do with this? What's another occasion where we see somebody meant a bad thing to happen and God was able to use it for good? What's that? Daniel, yes. Daniel chapter 6. Daniel in the lion's den. The 2 counselors and 120 satraps said, the king is going to make him over all of us. We can't let that happen. So they created a decree. Nobody's supposed to offer a petition to man or a god for 30 days, unless it's to King Darius. Well, Daniel knew about that decree, but he also put his faith in God, not in decrees. And so he went up to his upper chambers, where he always went, had some windows that faced towards Jerusalem. He'd pray there 3 times a day. The counselors showed up when he was praying. He's doing it. They brought him before the king. The king said, it's a law of the Medes and the Persians. I can't change it. And so he got thrown into the lion's den and spent the night there. What happened? Daniel came out the next morning, and those other 2 counselors and their families, they went in. Can you imagine those lions all night long have seen prime rib right there in front of them and not able to eat it because God sent his angels to keep them away. So they couldn't do anything about that. So to reward those lions, God says, okay, it's not prime rib, but it's good sirloin. We're going to give you a whole lot of that. So he throws in all those people. Donnie, you had your hand raised a few moments ago.
I was just going to say how the Jews unwittingly fulfilled God's plan through Jesus.
That was going to be my last one, but that's exactly right. They intended to take Jesus out because the people cared more about him than about them. It really comes down to jealousy. In fact, I think it's in Mark chapter 15, and I think it's verse 10 or 11, where it says, and Pilate knew that they had delivered him up because of envy. They were just jealous that the crowds were following Jesus. They used to be the big dogs. And now here's this itinerant rabbi from, good grief, Nazareth. Is anybody looking at it? Did you look that up, Mike? What verse and chapter is that? So Mark 15, verse 10? Okay, well, there we go. See, even a stopped clock is right twice a day. So yes, Jesus' death in the gospel. The martyrdom of God's people. I'll just do another one here. In Romans chapter 8, verse 31, it's a really wonderful section where it says, since God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but offered him up for us all, how shall he not also with him freely give us all things? Who will bring a charge against God's elect? God is the one who justified. And then he goes on and gives another one, and he says, for I am convinced that neither life, nor death, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus. But we are like sheep to be slaughtered. Paul says, we are like sheep to be slaughtered. But then he goes on to say, but in all these things we overwhelmingly conquer through him who loved us. So we're the conquerors in the midst of sword, famine, peril, nakedness, all those sort of things. We're victorious. See, this is why we shouldn't look at our situation from man's perspective and say, oh, good grief, they're going to kill me now. That all these sort of things are going to happen. Yeah, that's what they're going to do here. But you didn't expect to live here forever, did you? What somebody does is if they kill you here, immediately they have put you into the presence of God, who is going to reward you eternally for your faith. So they're not doing you any harm, they're doing you favors. Okay, Xerxes' response, verses 7 through 10 now in the latter part of our chapter. Let's see how much time we got. Oh, we're flying. The king arose, this is after she said, Haman is the one. It says, and the king arose in his anger from drinking wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king. I don't know if it was a look that the king gave when he stormed out of their banquet room right there, or what the deal was, but Haman knew, uh-oh, this is not good. And so he's begging Esther. Now see, he might not, well, let's just go ahead and read and see what we know. And so in verse 8, when the king returned from the palace garden into the place where they were drinking wine, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. See, he was there begging. He wasn't falling on Esther necessarily, but he was falling on the couch. But who knows how that looked to the king when he comes in just at that propitious moment. He's not kneeling in front of her, begging for his life. He falls on, I don't know, maybe it was too much wine. Whatever the case was, here he is falling on the couch. God records this, so it must be important for us to understand. And so where Esther was. Then the king said, will he even assault the queen with me in the house? So see, now it isn't just a matter of what Esther had, or what Haman had planned on doing. Now it's what he is doing in the king's, practically in the king's presence. And the word went out from the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. It's kind of like those things where somebody is being taken to a location they don't want them to know, that somebody puts a bag over the guy's face and all of a sudden, uh-oh, what's going to happen next? Well, then Harbona, one of the eunuchs who were before the king said, "Behold." Now this is where Haman's, remember he had the big thing where he created that gallows that was how tall? 75 feet tall. He made this big thing. I mean, I'm sure everybody in the capital probably, what are they doing over at Haman's place? Oh, they're building a gallows over there. Well, look at the size of that thing. I mean, don't we just have to keep the guy's feet off the ground? What is this? Made a big deal about it. So here, his pride becomes his downfall. Harbona, one of the eunuchs who before the king said, "Behold, indeed the gallows standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high," that's 75 feet, just like you guys said, 50 cubits high, which Hannah made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king. And the king said, "Hang him on it." Hang him. So they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. So here is Mordecai, who has spared the life of the king because, remember, he had revealed that plot that Teresh and that other guy who had stood at the palace door there where Mordecai always hung out. He heard them plotting to kill the king. And so when the day before, remember it was just the day before, that the king had the chronicles of what had happened in his realm. He had those read, and they came upon that part where Mordecai had told of this plot. And so the king asked, well, what did we ever do for Mordecai in this regards? Nothing. And so he says, well, which one of my officials is out in the palace? Oh, well, Haman's out there. Haman was out there for a reason. He was coming to the palace that day to ask the king permission to hang Mordecai from a 70-foot tall gallows. He had come to destroy Mordecai. And so the king asked Haman when he comes into the room, he says, what shall be done for the man whom the king desires to honor? Mordecai. Is there anybody prouder than Mordecai? I mean, who did the king say he wanted to honor by name? Anybody? Who did Mordecai hear? I mean, who did Haman hear? Well, he wants to honor me. Who would the king want to honor except me? You remember Lancelot, Sir Lancelot in the, what's the name of that movie, Chris? Camelot, yes. When Lancelot comes on the scene, Lancelot du Lac, he's from France, and he sings this song, C'est moi, c'est moi. I proudly admit, 'tis I, this wonderful guy. He said, if I had been made, he goes on to sing, if I had been made the partner of Eve, we'd be in Eden still. Okay, and the whole song is all about, it's me, c'est moi, it's me. Well, that's who Haman is thinking. It's all about me. So you ought to put a royal robe upon him, what only the king has worn, and put him on a steed that the king has ridden, and put a crown upon his head that the king has worn, and have him be led about the town square by one of your officials saying, such shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. And Haman is thinking, man, I can just see myself looking good in that robe and that hat. I'm gonna wear it kind of at an angle because that'll look cool, you know. And so the king says, yes, let it be done as you have said for Mordecai, and you shall do it, and do not neglect to do a thing that you have said. Can you imagine how terrible that must have been for Haman? But he did it. And now, so the king is familiar with Mordecai now. He's been reminded of him. And here one of the eunuchs that serves the king says, you know, Haman was going to kill Mordecai on those gallows that he has in front of his house. Hang him on it. Pretty interesting stuff. So, why didn't the king just order the death of Haman immediately? I mean, when she said what she had said, when Esther said what she had said, why didn't he just say, we need to kill Haman right now. Take him out, hang him on his gallows. Why didn't he do this? This is kind of a tougher question. So Put your,
He didn't change the law. I think he had to go back and think, how can I fix this now?
okay,
He signed it all.
that's right. Now, wow, you just nailed it. Good job, Deborah. That's exactly it. Remember, the king signed this law into effect, and he could not change the law because the law of the Medes and the Persians cannot be changed. And so he couldn't get him on that. What he could get him, though, is to try to assault his wife with him in the house. That he can kill him for. And so that's what he chose to do. That's in chapter 3, verses 10 through 12, where the king is the one who actually signs that decree. So, for what crime was Haman actually found guilty? Assaulting the queen. Now, we read about Harbona before on your sheet there, number 3. Who was Harbona, and where have we seen him before? Esther?
Esther. Yeah, he found Esther and he kind of befriended her and called her and
Oh, that would have made him somebody else, though. He wasn't that guy. He was one of the guys who was one of the 7 royal eunuchs back in chapter 1 and verse 10. And let me just go ahead and read that for us. And on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Habaktha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king. So, he serves in the king's presence. So that's who he was, one of the 7 royal eunuchs. Why do you think he said what he said in this chapter, in chapter 7 here in verse 9? Why do you think he was so much kind of on his case? Or I said 7, verse 9, yes. Why do you think he said what he said regarding Haman? Yes, Debbie?
I kind of think, since God mentioned that he knew, he's kind of like one of the, would be like the serpent, we know that, but they kind of had this grapevine, like we have Facebook and whatever. Well, so I'm sure that even, I think Esther kind of knew before the king that those gallows were going out there for us. I think that's what kind of gave that extra boldness at the end. But she just got like an exclamation point after wicked hanging. I mean, she's really upset and calling him, pointing out.
Yes, but it was Harbona was the one who said what he said.
I think she kind of knew behind the scenes.
Oh, okay.
But then, you know, my Bible says, look or behold. I think those gallows,
You-
maybe they've been looking.
You could see them from the palace garden.
He worked at the palace, and he might have had one of the things right outside. And it was so tall that he said, hey, look right there, you know what this guy's done.
Well, you'd probably expect that the people that are the higher officials would have their homes closer to the palace.
It kind of gives you that impression that it could be seen from where they were looking at.
Yeah, you almost get the sense that Harbona did not like Haman. Don't mess with the servants that don't like you. Okay,
Amen. Probably never showed him respect, because he didn't like Mordecai, because he thought he was Jewish. You know, so people that weren't deserving of his attention. So he probably always rooted for them.
oh yes, he wanted people to bow and scrape before him. Okay, final question as we're closing up. What eternal principle does Haman's fate illustrate? Here we have somebody who has this great plan to destroy all the Jews, but ultimately he's the one who ends up being destroyed. What is an eternal principle that we can understand from that particular situation? Well, you can certainly count that one. The wages of sin is death. Romans chapter 6 in the first part of verse 23.
Don't you think that he was just, thought he, when you think you're just too big to fail,
Ooh. So let him who stands, 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 12, let him who stands take heed lest he fall. That's a good one.
Analogous to Satan, he's planning our demise, and his going to be.
Oh, yes. Yeah. If you haven't seen the movie The Passion of the Christ, that's okay. If you're not somebody who's prepared yourself to see how horrible the things that Jesus had to endure are, don't go see that. But there is a scene at the end of that where it shows a drop of our Lord's blood going down, and apparently it's like it's going right down to in front of where Satan is, because Satan thought killing Jesus would give him the victory. It was in killing Jesus that he lost, big time. You know, that's where Satan was defeated. And in Colossians chapter 2, it tells us, verse 15, it says, when Jesus had disarmed the rulers and authorities, he made public display of them, having triumphed over them through the cross. So Jesus gave us the victory through the cross. Now, if we have the victory, who has the defeat? The one who's against us, Satan, and all that sort of thing. So yes, that's another one. You guys are great at this. Yes, sir, Larry?
Sort of, when she mentioned, in Esther chapter 6 and verse 13, it says that Haman informed his wife and all his friends of everything that had happened to him previously, that the script had been flipped. And now, he's not being honored, but it's Mordecai. She says, well, and his wise men and Jairus, his wife said to him, it's Mordecai before whom you have begun to follow the Jewish order, and you will not prevail. So it's kind of like, it's inevitable that you're not going to succeed in your plot.
Yeah, isn't that nice that your wife is, I mean, her and Mrs. Job would probably get winner and runner-up for the worst wife of the year award. You know, Mrs. Job, why don't you curse God and die? And here's her encouragement for her husband. You know, if he's a Jew, you're in big trouble, buddy. Kind of seeing her distance herself from him right there. The one I was thinking of is in Galatians chapter 6 and verses 7 and 8, where it tells us, you reap what you sow. You reap what you sow. And we see that Haman had some plans here, but the harvest was one that he had to eat. Okay, so next week, we're going to be covering chapter 8 and then chapter 9. We're going to do chapter 9 and chapter 10 together. I'm not going to do a whole thing on chapter 9. So we got 2 more weeks. The reason I say that is because we did this earlier, I think this year. Yeah, we're in August now, so it's earlier this year, where we had our class was built around the sermon that you guys had just heard. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use that series of lessons on grace that we're talking about for a period of question and answers. What about this? What about that? What about the other sort of things? And Guy and I might do something in regards to that class that might make it a whole lot of fun for y'all. I hope it's a whole lot of fun for me. But but anyhow, there's some stuff that we're thinking about doing with that. So anyhow, as I mentioned last week, I think this series on grace is going to be something of a turning point. Certainly it is for me, but I hope it is for us also, because I think that the more we begin to understand the grace of God and desire to start living our lives according to, remember we saw in Acts chapter 20 and verse 24, it's the gospel of God's grace. When we start living according to the gospel of God's grace, I think it's going to change. It's going to change us on the inside, and it's going to change relationships that we have on the outside. So anyhow, in 3 weeks, you can look forward to the first one of those. But next week, chapter 8, the week after, chapters 9 and 10 here in Esther, and then we will begin having those classes. Any other thoughts, questions, or comments regarding any of the stuff we talked about today? I'm just glad I was able to clear up everything then, since nobody has any questions. It's just all as clear as mud, something of that nature.
One comment on that, your sermon today. You know, when you're talking about the 2 men that are praying, but you notice that before the first one was praying, it says he was righteous and despised people. You know,
He viewed himself as righteous.
and but I mean, you know, you see that he thought of others as righteous, but you know, we're not covered with our own righteous. We're covered with God's righteous. But you know, a lot of times you see that in church. You see people think, well, I'm just so good that, you know,
Yeah.
they despise everybody else that's around them, that they don't think.
And I think, you know, that would probably be in one of the top 10 reasons why the church today, and Christianity in general, but is not growing. It's because we are coming at the people with, we're way up here, you're way down there kind of an attitude. And the thing is that everything that we've seen, you know, we have all sinned and fall short of God's glory. And so, yeah, that's a good point, Debbie. Let's go ahead and close with the word of prayer. Father, we're so thankful to you for this day that you've given to us and for the privilege, Father, that we have had to come before your throne to sing songs of praise and offer up prayers before your throne, recognizing you, Father, as the true and the only God. Father, we're so grateful to you for your love for us and how you expressed it to us through the gifts of your word, through your Spirit, and the gift of salvation through your Son. Father, thank you so much for all the blessings that you have bestowed upon us. But most of all, Father, even as it was said this morning, the greatest gift of all is your Son, Jesus. So, Father, for him more than anything, we give you thanks and offer this prayer in our lives to you in his name.